blame game of SolarWinds takes over the Senate while an attack against Microsoft steals the spotlight. And we celebrate Women's Month with security celebrity Didi Dayton and talk about security investment and the growing female influence. I'm Randy Watkins, and this is Son of a Breach. Welcome back, everyone. A couple of updates on SolarWinds to get started. We talked last time about the testimony in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee and what they were going to be looking for. Those testimonies have been ongoing, and so far there's not been really a lot of interesting stuff coming out of it. There's been talk about evidence against Russia and no evidence against anyone else. I think we all kind of expected that. There was a brief distraction that was kind of interesting where SolarWinds was blaming an intern for a really weak password. It was like SolarWinds 123. And there was a thought that they may have contributed to the breach overall, but I think SolarWinds eventually responded and said, no, that was patched pretty quickly after it was disclosed. They blamed it all on the intern and said this had nothing to do with the breach. These are not the droids you've been looking for. So I don't really think that had anything to do with it, but it was kind of interesting to see the flurry of articles that came out around weak passwords and the number of senators and congressional folks that were posturing on both sides talking about how much they knew about passwords, which was funny. There were a couple of pretty good comments about, stronger passwords being required for their kids to watch YouTube on an iPad or something like that. But I think all that was just kind of a distraction point in time. A little bit of blame game going on. Some fingers pointed back and forth of, was it SolarWinds' fault? They were supposed to be protecting us against Russia, which, I mean, if you know what SolarWinds does, you know that they're not a software system that is built to protect us against Russia. There was some blame thrown at Microsoft for having too complicated of an architecture, which I think I agree with that point. But to bring it up in the context of, they're kind of responsible because, it's their operating system that was exploited. I mean, you could really take that to the nth degree and say, without chairs, nobody could sit down and hack the Microsoft operating system. So I think it's the whole causation versus correlation type of discussion to have there. What's actually going to come out of this? No one really knows. I mean, they talked about, a few key points that they want to hit on. Of course, it always goes to, we don't have enough people. Well, we need more budget. Okay, so we'll expand the budget. But what do those people focus on? I did like the fact that they were talking about focusing those resources on hardening systems, because I think best practices have really kind of gone away, and we've looked at technology as more of a risk mitigation so we can put products in place where we don't want to put the best practices in. And I think that's proven to not be a great defense. So if we did, build out this new rank of cybersecurity individual, we did start bringing in those headcount. I think focusing them on hardening systems, doing things like proper identity and access control, least privileged, I don't think that's a total waste of time. I think that's pretty solid. I've long evangelized capabilities around identity auditing and doing things like least privilege. I mean, there are a bunch of products out there. Varonis and StealthBits have always been kind of pushing the forefront of that. CyberArk also had a capability to do that. I'm sure they still do. Newer ones that are more cloud focused, like CloudKnox. I absolutely love that product. Very interesting capabilities there. So I'm a big fan of implementing foundational controls, especially where identity is concerned. Doing best practice hardening on everything from cloud services to endpoints is always a great idea. So if they did take time to step back and say, hey, let's go back to the basics and implement basic security posture across our endpoints, across our services, time well spent, in my opinion. And I also think that's a lesson that could be, capitalized on from the private side as well as they go through and harden the systems. I would hope that they would pass the guidance along to the private sector around, the steps that they took, the things that they ran into, kind of lessons learned. And that was something else that came up, which I do really like, was the promotion of broader sharing of threat intelligence. That was something that was mentioned by all of the witnesses that were called in. So you had Kevin Mandia from FireEye, you had Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. You had SolarWinds in attendance, and George was on from CrowdStrike as well. They all kind of recommended, like, hey, it would be great if there was a better way to share threat intelligence. from private sector to public sector, between different private sector companies. And there's plenty of platforms out there. And there's different ISACs, so information sharing guilds, where you can join on. And there's FSISAC and ONG ISAC. And I mean, there's tons of different circles that you can share that threat intelligence in. But even then, I mean, you start to see we're distributing the threat intelligence. Right. So what if there's a nation state attack and they're not just targeting the financial sector, but they're using the same IOCs and TTPs across the oil and gas sector? Wouldn't it be helpful to be able to bring all that stuff into one place? I contend that it would be. And I think that's the global contention as well. So obviously there's a ton of nuance to that, right? How do you anonymize it? Do you anonymize it? There was talk, and this is where it starts to get a little bit hairy, but around disclosure. So any breach, anytime you have to disclose. I don't know how I feel about that. I haven't thought about all the edge cases yet. In general, I'm pro on disclosure. Let me know if my data was leaked. Data wasn't leaked. Does it need to be disclosed? Should you just share the IOCs and TTPs? There's a lot of thought to go in around that. It's not as black and white as I think many would think it to be when you start going into brand damage from the result of a 0 day. Well, does it actually fall onto the brand that had the disclosure because of the 0 day, or does it go to the manufacturer that had the 0 day that forced the brand to have disclosure? Then you have to start auditing the controls that surround that. Just turns into a big complicated mess, in my opinion. So I don't know about the disclosure piece, but overall, the sharing of threat intelligence, I definitely promote that if we can find a great way to do it in a way that operationalizes threat intelligence. I think that's something where we say threat intelligence like everybody knows how to use it. We just make this assumption that if you hit this button called threat intelligence, all of the threats that the intelligence knows about go away. But that's not actually the case. You have to be able to operationalize that through your SIM, through your EDR, through your EPP, through your NDR, whatever products you have. So we have to think beyond just how do we share the intelligence and more along the lines of how do we operationalize it. There's also the hunting of conversation around threat hunting. Interesting. Given the panel, you can probably guess who from the dais recommended this control. But an emphasis on threat hunting, and that is, looking for an attacker that's bypassed all of the other defenses. Obviously, CriticalStart thinks slightly different about this, given the way that we've built our platform. But threat hunting is kind of one of those things where you don't know what you don't know, and you can hunt for it, but you're also hunting for what you don't know. It seems like we should be able to come up with a better solution rather than just throwing humans at it and saying, hey, go find something, right? Well, go find what? And so not only are you lacking the goal, the vision, the definition, the end picture, but you're also lacking the headcount, the resources, and the expertise most of all. So now you have to teach all of these folks how to hunt, which is, I don't think that's not a worthwhile goal. I mean, learning hunting techniques and capabilities and different queries, I think is good, but what CriticalStart has done is, if it's a query that you would threat hunt on, just turn that into an alert and then resolve every single alert that you have coming in. So slightly different approach, but definitely something that if it was adopted would certainly strengthen security postures. I mean, it works for our customers. Moving on, SolarWinds has been really fun. And I think 18,000 potentially infected or affected companies is good, but Microsoft really blew it out. A recent breach against Exchange, and this is Exchange on-premise and hybrid, exposes, you get mixed estimates. Some people say potentially 30,000 organizations that are vulnerable. I've seen another estimate as high as 60,000 organizations vulnerable to the attack. But it allows not only access to the emails themselves, but also the ability to install malware, which is interesting. Now, it looks like the breach was initially discovered or at least noticed back in January, but it's really just been the last week or so that we've started to get more details. Supposedly, it's a Chinese-backed attack group, and that has yet to be confirmed, but I think it's pretty strong suspicion at this point that it is a nation-state attack by the group named Tanium, which is an interesting name. But yeah, I mean, multiple 0 days disclosed. Microsoft, of course, came out with patches immediately. There's some CISA guidance that got released. And I'm sure everybody knows this, but I record the podcast and then it has to go through production. So right now it's Wednesday. By the time this thing comes out, it'll probably be Tuesday of next week. And there's going to be a ton of additional information. So this is more FYSA. which if you don't know what that TLA means, it is for your situational awareness. Shout out to Mona Gadiri for educating me on that. I thought it stood for Florida Youth Soccer Association after a quick Google. It does not. So that message brought to you by our good friends over at ADD. Just like cayenne pepper, if you sprinkle a little bit on your food, it's interesting. If you put on too much, it's unpalatable. So back to the breach. There's some great articles, some great timelines. I mean, of course, refer to Microsoft. They have a full write-up there. Hacked had a pretty good article kind of comparing this to the SolarWinds breach. Critical Start, of course, we put out a summary of findings. We put out a little bit of a timeline. We put out some different IOCs, also the PowerShell scripts that are available to evaluate your Exchange environment. There's also a site to check your OWA. It's checkmyowa.unit221b.com. And that'll do a lot of the triage for you. So great resources that are out there. And like I said, by Tuesday, there will be even more resources and we'll have a better idea of what's going on, who is actually impacted, and hopefully the scope of the breach, the attackers, and we'll essentially have to carry this thing out just like SolarWinds. So do check out the resources, do look at your environment, do patch your systems and make sure that you're up to date. If you need any help, Critical Start, of course, we've mobilized some resources. We have our incident response team ready to go. The SOC has already taken the IOCs, pumped them into the system, retroactively looked at anybody that still has an on-premise or a hybrid designed Exchange environment. So if you're under the Critical Start umbrella, we've already been looking for you. This will absolutely develop. There's going to be another hearing into this case. This is going to be potentially larger than SolarWinds. So brace yourself. And I think this really points towards something that I've talked about, it seems like pretty consistently on this podcast, which is APTs aren't going anywhere. It had been a few years since we've had some big ones, but it seems like they're going to start pouring out. And I think everybody realizes that cyber attacks are the way of the future. So I don't plan on this slowing down even a little bit. Moving on, March is Women's Month, as most of you probably know. And in celebration of women in the cybersecurity field, I'd like to take a moment to throw some shout outs out to some of the female influencers that I follow or think very highly of. So start off with Microsoft and Ann Johnson. And she has absolutely led the charge in this whole security portfolio development and really leading the charge of building Microsoft's vision of a security company. I think she's done a great job at executing on that. I know we just got done talking about an O-Day that's affecting Exchange, but hopefully most people realize that those two are not the same. And the security portfolio of Microsoft has been rapidly growing and very, very competitive. The features that they're coming out with, the problems that they're solving, and the speed at which they're releasing, and has done a great job at building a vision and executing on that for Microsoft. So she's definitely one to follow. Palo Alto Networks has quite a few great leaders, especially in product that I've had the pleasure of working with over there. So Leah, she's VP of product. She ran a lot of the early endpoint development, the early XDR development. She's a longtime Palo Alto, leader there. Fantastic. Honestly, probably one of the smartest people I've ever talked to. She's just an absolute delight. Very, very high level thought leader. Hadar over there, she came over as part of the Secdo acquisition and really pioneered and led in the development of XDR, which has really come quite a ways in the last couple of years. So shout out to her. I think she was recently promoted in the last year or so to a VP as well. And Nalima is another product manager that I've worked with. She came over as part of Demisto, and I had the pleasure of working with her both at Demisto and then again at Palo Alto. And her ability to wrap her mind around all the capabilities of automation and what the customers are going to use it for, absolutely fantastic. Of course, I have to give shout outs to some of the ladies at Critical Start. I mean, hiring only the best has definitely resulted in some amazing female talent being added to the roster. Start off both a cybersecurity and a culinary degree, really created the basis for one of my favorite artists, as well as an all-around detection extraordinaire. She's written some articles that she's thrown up on LinkedIn. And if you don't follow Maris Raymer, you're absolutely missing out. She is phenomenal. She has a very unique voice. And when it comes across very plainly and very clearly. It's easy to learn from. New to the team, but already building influence with her expertise. Mona Gadiri, I gave a shout out to her earlier. She's not only the queen of 3-letter acronyms, but she's also a powerhouse on the product team, really leading the charge in our continuous development for both Microsoft and Palo Alto. Just really comes in with a head of knowledge and doesn't hold on to it. Right. She'll educate anybody that is within an earshot of her. And she's definitely made her presence felt on the team. Last but certainly not least, the core of Critical Start is family, and Tara Davis, our co-founder and managing director, definitely responsible for not only building that family mentality, but keeping it in place over the kind of stage of hypergrowth. So huge shout out to Tara. And I think I'd also be remiss if I didn't take a moment to praise my better half for 11 years, Sheila, who has not only supported my career development, but has also been building her own name in cybersecurity as a world-class field marketer now at Trend Micro. So shout out to those folks. And this certainly is not an exhaustive list, right? There's a growing number of women moving into and dominating the cybersecurity world, not because they're women, but because they're among the best at what they do. Right. So I want to make it very clear that I don't give shout out to people just because of their gender. I give shout outs to people because they're thought leaders, they're visionaries, they have expertise that extends beyond what I've encountered with anybody, man, woman, or otherwise. So huge shout out to those ladies and all the ladies that are really pioneering the way forward in cybersecurity. And for this episode, it's my absolute pleasure to be speaking with one of these pioneers, not just for women, but in the security space in general. She's held executive positions in sales, channel, and alliances for more than 20 years across multiple successful security companies, and is now partner at Wing Venture Capital, Miss Didi Dayton.
Thank you for having me. I'm obviously a big fan of your work, and it's really an honor to be here.
I appreciate it. Let's start off with how you got into security and what your current role at Wing is.
Interesting. I got into security back in 1999 when we were talking about Y2K. And across the street from where I was working was a company called Surf Control. So I got introduced that way and then fell in love with cybersecurity and just stayed. My role at Wing is I'm a partner. So Wing Venture Capital, we're an early Series A, early stage investment fund. And I run the customer community.
That's awesome. We'll definitely dive into Wing and talk about their investment thesis and more about what's interesting from there. But I want to start off talking about the various positions that you've held. So you've gone back and forth between sales and channel. You had titles like Chief Revenue Officer before it was trendy. You've also been VP of Worldwide Channel, Sales, Alliances. Which traits do you see allowing you to have been successful in both of those roles and the various positions you've been in over the years?
Yeah, I think the best sales leaders can juggle a lot of pressure and a lot of different kinds of pressures all at one time. And they really are able to stay laser focused on hitting the number and also helping their customers solve complex problems. Channel folks also do hit a number, but it's indirect. So both require a lot of humility. In a worldwide channels role, you're clearing the space for the sales team to be able to operate. So you're clearing the path, getting rid of all the boulders, getting rid of the trees that have fallen, and basically clearing the road so that you have multiple paths to market. And ideally, you're one step ahead of the sales team in terms of anticipating their needs. But you're also responsible for things like most people don't think about, like FCPA contracts, margins, maintaining multiple supply chains, and really, working with organizations that you do not directly control. So it's a different skill set. I see the difference between the two as sales are more mavericks and builders, where channel folks are more consultants and scalers.
You mentioned a variety of traits there, and I want to touch on humility because I think that's one that's difficult to develop, but extremely important. Can you describe, maybe some situations that helped you kind of get that sense of humility? I know that's one that most leaders don't just naturally have.
Yeah, I think it comes from working with a team, and as a team, it comes from recognizing that some people are better at doing things than you are. And it does require humility to be able to step away from something that you think you could do and allowing your team to do it on their own and do it better. So that's one example. Another is, when you decide to move on, and whenever I start a role now, I always think about succession planning. So I'm always thinking, okay, how can I build up the skill set within my team so that this thing can run itself? And ideally, I can work my way out of a job and ideally onto the next one and do so with grace, right? And by promoting everyone on the way out. So The humility comes from learning from others and really allowing organically for the team to develop and the team to take ownership.
There's definitely an air of self-confidence there as well, because if you're not confident in what you're doing or your ability to continue to provide value, even after, like you said, you work your way out of a job, you build up a team that can do the role that you were hired to do, then you're much less likely to go down that path if you're not confident. So I think that confidence is a quality that's required, especially on the sales side, but in leadership in general.
I agree. It's something you have to practice. As a woman, you really have to build up that muscle, because men tend to be inherently, and I'm going to be general, but men tend to be more comfortable being competitive, directly competitive, where women tend to be indirectly competitive. They'll complement one another, but then they'll also kind of tear each other down sometimes. And so what you'll find is that there isn't that much very straightforward kind of talk of like, this is where I want to be. This is what I can do. And that is the level of simplicity that it requires to actually get the job.
Yeah, the confidence is definitely an important piece, especially like you said, for a woman being in a very male-dominated industry. And we'll certainly touch on that, especially given that March is Women's Month. But I do want to talk about the PE side, and I want to dig into Wing a little bit. Obviously, you have a ton of experience with multiple exits in various leadership roles. So there's a lot that you can bring to the table. How are you contributing to the investment strategy at Wing and the existing portfolio companies and the kind of customer community that they're building out?
Yeah, it's been really interesting and fun. It's such an incredible environment to be in when you're in VC. And I say that because the folks that I'm surrounded by have PhDs, and they've been building and running and supporting businesses and early stage founders all the way through exit for many, many years. And so every day I learn so much from my team. What I would say in terms of, how I help is I'm always passionate about finding really cool technology. And I love talking to customers, kind of geeking out about what are you seeing out there, what's interesting, and then also trying to help them solve complex issues. A big part of that is just listening. So I feel like building out networks and building out workshops and doing, some of the blocking and tackling of what you do to create a community. But a big part of it is really just trying to thread through the needle to help people find what they need. Sometimes it's other people, sometimes it's ideas, sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's tools, services. So really listening carefully to what they're looking for and then helping them find that perfect fit.
Yeah, a lot of the customers that we work with, they understand that there's money, right? There's tons of money in the investment in the security space, but they don't necessarily understand the back end. And there's all this talk about different PE companies and VC companies and various A, B, C, angel seed rounds. You actually broke down VC versus PE for me pretty well. Can you give a high level of what the investment environment looks like behind the scenes?
Yeah, when you're in VC, and I can speak mostly to what we're doing because that's where I've spent the time, we're looking for early stage companies that have, potential for being a category creator and where there's going to be a multi-billion-dollar multiple exit. And we're looking for organizations that have a customer-first approach. From behind the scenes, what that looks like is as you're looking at the organization and you're listening to their pitch, our guys are hardwired to listen for things that I wouldn't even consider listening for. Not just their business acumen, but how well do they understand the space that they're in? How well can they balance between building a team and building an enterprise? Those kinds of things that are subtleties, but are super critical at the early stage because they just manifest over time and then amplify. So if you have a leader that is blind in a certain area and doesn't recognize that, then that can be a red flag, for example. When you look at an investment, we typically look at them for 6 to 8 years out because that's the average amount of time for an exit. And so, we're entering into a long-term relationship. Anything, just like any other relationship, any red flags, you want to try to address them up front during the negotiation. And then if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. You walk away.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned there that I think is really interesting is recognizing the problem that you're solving. I think in security, we see many examples of solutions with no problem, or they're maybe not tackling it correctly, or they don't understand the customer perspective or the persona that's actually pursuing their solution. And I'm a big fan of watching different PEs and VCs like Wing, because when you look at their investments and you look at the companies that they're going after, a lot of times you see a trend in what's getting actively invested in, and it's usually forward thinking in the market. What is Wing looking at right now that's kind of bleeding edge, or what is the focus of the investments right now?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I love that question because that's really where we live is 2 to 3 to 5 years in the future. And that's what makes, a great VC is their ability to anticipate the trends and really identify way before it's obvious. And that's really our specialty is identifying organizations that matter and that will matter in the future. So our investments have really been on trend. And it was interesting to watch during the pandemic because you saw a lot of these things that were long-term play out very rapidly, especially the movement to the cloud. We invested, for example, in Snowflake back in 2012. And at that time, it was very much not obvious that the cloud, would have such a focus for so many large enterprises. And I mean, along with that comes the agile workplace. And that's something that's caused a ton of headaches for folks. With the attack surface being so much larger, obviously phishing is a huge vector and we're seeing a lot of ransomware play out. And now there's a whole nother headache around asset inventory and unmanaged assets. And all of that is very difficult to defend with the workforce not even being in the office. So I see, SASE is a lot more relevant and we've added to that in our investments, DLP for endpoint, identity and digital trust and privacy protections. But I see a lot of money going into developer tools. There's a lot of money in general right now. The valuations are insane. There's focus on automation and hyper automation, a new term that Gartner was using, AI, visualization. I mean, I think everyone's trying to reduce the noise and get better visualization so they can make better decisions. So there's still a ton going on with AI. And I like some of these trends like microsegmentation, a lot of the cloud security that's happening. We invested in, secure storage. You'll appreciate this. I was trying to coin a new term and I was like, the modern enterprise is data driven. And so we've built out what is effectively the modern enterprise security stack. And then somebody pointed out, doesn't that spell mess? Yeah, actually it does.
I don't think an acronym has ever been as accurate as that one.
Right.
That's good. You could absolutely coin that.
Thank you. I'm not sure that our marketing team will want to run with it, but for me, it's working. So yeah, I mean, the thing that at this day and age that I find interesting is that customers recognize the need to change. So they're rapidly changing and getting very tactical on their projects. They've abandoned a lot of their strategic projects and they're spending money very wisely, but they haven't clearly communicated back to their legal and procurement teams what business risks they are now willing to adopt that they were previously not willing to. So this is my rant. Why is it that CIOs and heads of IT or other buyers are not clearly asking the legal teams to shift their focus from what used to be an acceptable amount of risk that their legal teams and procurement teams were willing to take, and now allowing for that technology purchase to happen without it being an 18-month selling cycle? Why does it always have to take that long for these large customers to buy when the whole world changed? They can change their processes and adapt just a little tiny bit.
That's a really interesting point. And so combining essentially what COVID has done with this whole shift to remote, the expanding attack surface, I mean, a lot of the things that you just talked about, like, hey, your strategic roadmap for the next 3 years essentially changed overnight when everybody started working from home. But the ability for us to calculate a budget or an increased budget off of the new risk that we were accepting didn't seem to change at all. Mm-hmm. What do we attribute that to? Is that due to security's focus on controls rather than, calculating the dollar value of risk? Or like, why do you see that process being so slow to change?
I don't think it has anything to do with security. And actually, the budgets are going down, and that's just a natural byproduct of where we've all been and where the world is today. Many of our industries are still coming back up to speed, although it's nice to see that the world is sort of slowly coming back as folks are getting vaccinated. I think it has more to do with there being alignment across the business, especially at the top. So yes, IT has mobilized. Yes, everyone, HR, marketing has become more digital. Sales has become more digital. Everyone's digital. And yet, the procurement processes have not changed in decades. And that's something that a customer actually pointed out to me. And customers are smarter than me, just like partners are smarter than all of us, because you're seeing and hearing the problem at scale. And really, it comes down to procurement teams being willing to relook at what they can and cannot control. And working with the business team and working with the legal teams. But the legal teams also aren't helping because they're often negotiating business terms that were relevant when they were relevant. when they were at the top of their stack. And the reason it's so important, and the reason I'm ranting about this, is because I'm seeing businesses that are growing from 0 to 100 million in the blink of an eye in the global marketplace, especially the digital marketplace. And it's sort of a warning system for those very established businesses that are like, well, our brand can never fail. Our brand is so big that everyone knows our name. And it's like, yeah, but there are a lot of names that are coming up that you've never heard of, and you should. And so this is something that Wing did that I really love. It's called the Enterprise Tech 30 list. It's the definitive list of the hot startups to watch, not just in cyber. And honestly, it's a cool tool because it talks a lot about what those trends are, but also because there's not a single Wing company on there this year. So last year at the top of the list was Snowflake, but this year at the top of the list is HashiCorp. So you'll recognize other names like Zapier and Databricks and, some of these other cool companies that are doing amazing things. Auth0 is on there and LaunchDarkly. So there are some security companies, and that's definitely a key consideration.
And for those who don't follow the M&A sphere of security, Auth0 just picked up by Okta for $6.5 billion. That's a pretty good buy. I think I saw one of their investors cashed out with something like 20x their initial investment. So not bad if you were able to sink in some cash early on. Looking at customers, you're responsible for Wing's customer network. Who do you generally see being the earlier adopters of the more bleeding edge, forward-thinking technology? So, CriticalStart operates out of Tola with a good sized footprint. So Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas, for those not familiar with the TLA. And we generally only have one or two companies that are very forward thinking or bleeding edge or really pushing the bounds of security and looking at these Series A companies that are coming to market with a cool solution. Where do you generally find the most acceptance for these bleeding edge technologies across the customer network?
Interesting question. It comes down to the leadership. And I was very surprised because I didn't think that many of these large institutions and banks and large organizations in general were very tuned into what's going on in the market. I didn't think they were, but it turns out they actually have these incredible business development teams that know everything about what's going on out there. And they're watching the trends like a hawk, but they're often not empowered. And that's where that rant previously came from. It's like, you shouldn't be waiting 17 months for a 20K POC. That's ridiculous, right? And the thing is that if everyone were to move forward at the time they actually needed a tool or a product, then that company, it's a self-fulfilling thing. Then that company would stick around longer. So it's up to customers to recognize that, you may be taking a little bit of a risk with that 20K. And maybe the company won't be around in 24 months. And that's one of the considerations that you have to have. But really, 24 months, like, things happen overnight now.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be that big of a concern.
Yeah. You can't afford to accept that risk for the 24 months that you don't have the solution in place.
Yeah, exactly. And the CISO of Okta, a great guy, he had a couple of great quotes. One of them was, "Don't dance faster than the music," which I thought was pretty awesome. But he was also talking about, just in general, how organizations have to be willing to take that step, and that the Valley, he's asking about Silicon Valley, and he said the Valley doesn't care about risk. The Valley cares about being relevant. And when you apply that to very large organizations, that's the crux of where your question comes from, is how willing are you to take risk? How willing are you to move forward with something innovative, knowing that it may not be perfect? And again, it comes down to the top leadership, because if it's not such a downside to adopt new technology and start new things and try new things, then you'll find that the whole organization is galvanized by that. And a great example of that is Amazon, right? And that's not to not give credit to the others. I mean, all of the platform providers out there are doing amazing things that are very innovative. But what I like about Amazon is that it's crowdsourced from within their ranks. Mm-hmm. So they make decisions without it having to come from the top. They empower their organization across the organization to help make decisions. And it's all about decisions. When the Maersk team was hacked and the CEO was presented with a catastrophic failure in communication because all of their systems were compromised. And keep in mind, these guys have thousands of containers and ships all around the world that are shipping hazardous and perishable materials. How do you communicate in those kinds of dire situations? That guy was amazing. You know what he did? He sent a text to his leadership team because he happened to have them on his phone. And it said, customer first, you are empowered to make all decisions, both legally and financially, do the best thing for the customer. And guess what? They didn't have any issues. But somebody had to delegate down and think of the things that mattered. And it was customer first, legal and financial, down into the business. And that's where it should be with all organizations. You should empower your teams.
Absolutely. That's so we tend to follow some of the Amazon philosophies at Critical Start, and a couple of the things that we like to do. Fail fast. So let's try ideas. Let's get them on the table, see if they work. If they don't, then let's move on to the next thing. And also, failure is a team sport. So go down swinging and take everybody with you and really try things, shoot for the fences and keep the customer in mind. So the 3 core tenets that kind of overlay literally everything else that we do internally: do what's right for the customer, do what's right for employees, and don't do things that suck. So you follow those 3 rules, and there's quite a bit of leniency there. But getting that pushed down to kind of the decision maker level at the organizations that are facing the risk and trying to mitigate the risk, I think that's a long-term goal and something that we have to change almost as a culture inside of the organization over time.
Yep.
So let's talk about your dog. You have a wonderful French bulldog named Crumpet. How did Crumpet get her name?
She had many names before we landed on Crumpet, and that one was sort of accidental. We kind of backed into it, to be honest. And I totally shot myself in the foot with that because French bulldogs, especially when they're super cute, everybody wants to stop and talk about them. And so now, especially with COVID, I have to explain her name through a mask. And what better name for a French spoiled dog than a British pastry?
You should probably carry one around as a prop. That way, instead of explaining it, you can just hold out a Crumpet.
I've considered t-shirts. She gets a lot of attention. I joke about the fact that she gets no attention and people don't get it. It's like they ask the same questions. It's adorable, really. It gets me out of my shell and stops me talking about security all the time.
Yes, and French bulldogs definitely do get the attention. We have a little one named Ickis. He got his name from the Real Monsters cartoon, if anybody remembers that. They're cute little dogs, but at least ours is pretty much a hairy potato when it comes to IQ.
Crumpet's not the brightest on the tree either.
But at least they're cute.
Yep.
So March is Women's Month, and security is undoubtedly a male-dominated industry, which we've talked about a little bit. But it's definitely been growing in terms of the female contributions across functions, from sales to channels to engineering and executive leadership. What mentor figures did you have or did you look up to that helped guide your career? And what recommendations do you have for females that are currently in cybersecurity or interested in moving into the industry?
Yeah, I love this whole awareness and have heard some great things from folks lately. I had a lot of mentors. For example, my CEO at Surf Control, for those of you who remember Surf Control, was Pat Soltz, and she would call it Pat Soltz like results because it was really hard to spell. But yeah, she was a badass in every way. And same with the chief legal officer at FireEye, Lexa King. She's handled some really tough waters recently. And she's just unflappable and ridiculously intelligent and just amazing. In terms of other women, I love the women on your team. Tara's fantastic at smoothing everything out. You'd never know what she does behind the scenes, and yet she does everything. So she's definitely someone to look up to in terms of building an amazing business. But yeah, the world generally is moving to a more people-centric place. So whether that means recruiting from a wide talent pool, or whether that means training folks remotely or communicating clearly what your strategy is all the way down to your execution. Those are things that typically women do excel at, right? So communicating, getting in a wide variety of, perspectives and making a lot of asking for inputs before making decisions. And I think traditionally that has led people to look at women as not being indecisive, when in reality, they're looking for consensus so that when that decision is made, there's no one holding back. And also the decision is made with everyone's perspective in mind, which means it's a better decision. And that plays out in the numbers. So when you look at boards of directors, for example, that have women on them, they perform better because they have a broader perspective. So it's not just looking at your constituency and making sure that, from your talent to your customer teams, you look like them and your board looks like them. It's also just making better people decisions, which is where a lot of these are coming down to. With a remote everything and work from anywhere, that means there's going to be a lot more pressure on businesses to retain talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I shout out to a few of the females that I follow in the industry, and a lot of them are on the product side. And I think that plays into exactly what you were talking about, which is, women just have a better ability to listen, to gain perspective, to empathize, to sympathize, to really understand more deeply before making a decision or before, proposing a solution to something. And that's really something that I think the security industry has been seeing and starting to take advantage of when they're looking for the best and the brightest and, how do I get that competitive edge? If you're not taking advantage of those different perspectives, like you said, you really shortchange yourself and your organization quite a bit.
Yeah, because people don't really like to give their opinion unless they're kind of made to. And, you asked me for advice for women. So here's some advice. Be in the room when decisions are being made and break the circle, right? If you see a circle of men talking figuratively or actually, just use your elbows and gently break into the circle and take your place and be confident about everything you do. And the way that you do that is you develop your skills, right? You present, you negotiate, you learn about finance, you learn about things that are outside of your comfort zone. That will give you confidence. And then hang out with people that boost you up, because that's where the power comes from, is from within. Take responsibility. And one of my favorite quotes comes from a surprising place, but not really when you think about it. And that's Beyonce. So Beyonce is actually an amazing businesswoman. She just doesn't market herself that way. But what she said was, power is not given to you, you have to take it. And I really love that. And the way that I've done it in my career is by owning the data and managing the data in such a way that I could get insights from it. And I always made arguments that were driven by data. And when you do that, no one can argue with you because it makes business sense. You know what you're talking about. It's your data. You built it. There's no argument. So yeah, there's a lot of great women out there, and hopefully we'll uncover more and more.
I'm sure we will. And I love what you say about confidence. I mean, that's, to me, one of the bigger things that kind of anybody that wants to be a future leader needs to work on. And you don't have to have confidence to come across as confident, is another thing. And that goes into building your skills. How do you present? How do you talk? What are your mannerisms? Just the tone of your voice. How do you use that to your advantage in kind of all of the conversations? And then when you combine that with expertise and genuine thought like data analytics and being able to discern unique perspective from gathering multiple opinions from different people across the organization, that's how you really become a valuable asset. And then, like you said, using your elbows to break through the circles of men to get up into the leadership ranks. It's a very powerful combination. And if there is anybody that still, for whatever reason, kind of underrates or underestimates women, they got another thing coming, because it's really women who have the most to gain and the tools to do so.
I like that. Yeah. There's a lot to developing process. Like, look at cybersecurity. How much of it is operational now? It's about workflows and building processes. And women are really, really good at that. So I know we've been talking and thinking a lot about what our future leaders are going to look like, especially in cybersecurity. And I'm lucky enough to be a part of this incredible group of women leaders. Yeah, we all believe in mentoring. We all believe in promoting skills across the board and diversity across the board. But there's so much going on that we can be identifying. Even finding new leaders is something where it always amazes me when people are like, well, we really don't know where to find great women in cybersecurity. And it's like, they're sitting across the table from you. If you listen to them, you would find they actually have a lot to say.
Yeah. And I think that does come also from, like you said, find those who are going to lift you up, not kind of view you as competition. When it comes to, women finding that support group internally, whether it's more women or other men inside the organization that just realize the value and potential. I think that's kind of critical in breaking a lot of these thought leaders out of their shells or out of their kind of lack of confidence. And for the listeners that might have school-age daughters that are considering STEM careers, is cybersecurity a place where you can find future, you can find that support group, you can find those people that are willing to lift you up?
Yeah, it requires a lot of cooperative thinking. It also requires a lot of adversarial thinking. And when you think about people skills and understanding how adversaries think and preempting what they do, I think if you want to look for fierce and social engineering ruthlessness, you can learn a lot from a bunch of teenage women.
Absolutely. Great advice. Really appreciate the perspective. And thanks for the conversation, Didi. We'll talk to you again soon.
Randy, it was an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode. Do follow us on all the socials, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, MySpace, LiveJournal, whatever you want. And be sure to tune in next time. We're going to have on our CFO, Andrew Kaufman, to talk about quantifying risk, mitigating risk, transferring risk, and really how do you start that conversation at more of a financial level rather than a security level to elevate that conversation to the board. So it should be either really, really interesting or really, really boring, depending on what your interest is. So tune in, don't tune in. We'll find out later on Son of a Breach.